俺の財宝か？欲しけりゃくれてやる。探せ！この世の全てをそこに置いてきた。
Yo guys, and welcome to this new video of the Void Century series where I discuss about an element that, differently from those I talked about in the previous videos of this series, the Ancient Kingdom, Joy Boy and the Deep, is not yet officially confirmed to be connected to that erased past, but as we will see in a moment, there are many convincing elements supporting this idea. But before seeing all of that in detail, let me say that I publish new videos every week, so make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell to always know when I upload something new. Alright, with that said, let's jump straight into it. So the first thing to consider when talking about devil fruits is that even if the greatest amount of information we have about them comes from the results of scientists like for example Vegapunk, their features don't allow to explain everything about them just using an exclusively scientific approach. And a very clarifying example of that is what Oda revealed in the SBS of volume 77, where in his answer to a fun question he revealed that if a second person was to bite a fruit already bitten by someone else, he won't acquire the ability as well, since no matter what, the power is always solely obtained by the first biter, and what remains is only an awfully tasting fruit. And in my opinion, the only way to explain this aspect is entering the realm of supernatural. Indeed, we know for a fact that it doesn't matter where you bite the fruit, you will always get the ability, which means the power is distributed all over the volume of the fruit. However, for what the author said in that SBS, we also know that as long as you are the first one to bite, it doesn't matter if you eat a tiny piece or the entire fruit, you will always be the only one to get the ability. Moreover, the remaining part will maintain shape, color and even taste, and so literally the only thing that changes is the capability to give the power. However, that same part would have been the only one capable to give the ability if it was bitten first. But this also implies that if you cut the fruit in two different pieces, as long as one of them is not eaten, they both maintain the capability to give the power, and we can assume this is true no matter how distant they are from each other. And so in this situation we will practically have two copies of the same devil fruit. However, even if these two parts were put in opposite points of the world, the moment one would be eaten, the other would completely lose any possibility to give the ability, even in a context where two people were trying to bite the pieces at the same time, since no matter how small the gap between the two bites, the ability will always only go to the first person. This aspect I just discussed is also one of the proofs that not only the ability clearly can't correspond to a material component of the fruit, but also that it exists as an entity separated and independent from the fruit itself, so that instead of thinking that eating a particular rare type of fruit a person acquires an ability, we should think that the act of eating transfers this mysterious entity, which is the power, from its previous container, the fruit, to the next, the eater. And if we assume this power is something that can't be divided in pieces like the fruit, but that instead stretches itself as the different parts are spaced from each other, always remaining present in each single piece, then we can explain the previous example with this intangible substance instantly moving into the person who first bites one of the pieces. Moreover, the fact that Lin obtained her ability literally by eating mother caramel proves that fruits are not even necessary in the transmission of the power, and that human beings are not different from them in the way they contain and pass the ability to the eater. Furthermore, we know that when the user of a devil fruit ability dies, the nearest fruit of the same type transforms and becomes the new devil fruit. And basing on how Oda represented this process in Smiley's case during the Punk Hazard arc, we can easily interpret this transformation with the power moving from the dead body of the person, or in this case of the poisonous gas, into its default container, the fruit. And actually in that situation, the fact the fruit transformed without touching the dead gas which before contained the ability supports the idea that what passed from Smiley to the apple was something immaterial. So all of these considerations mean that instead of focusing on devil fruits, we should focus instead on devil powers, which use fruits as standard containers and humans as mediums who can even momentaneously transfer it to the surrounding objects through the mysterious process of awakening. So at this point we understood that the power must be considered an independent entity. But then we can make a very interesting and important consideration. Indeed, this continuous circle of the devil power between living beings and fruits must have begun somehow. And since just like fruits are apparently the default destination of the power when the person dies, the ability seems meant to be used by humanoid beings rather than other animals, seeing how in both Pierre's and Chopper's cases the zone clearly doesn't work normally, as evident from the doctor's animal form that doesn't completely transform him into a human as it should, but maintains reindeer features. The fact that the power only manifests itself if contained by a human, while if contained by a fruit, it in practice doesn't exist and doesn't influence the world until a person eats that very fruit, suggests the devil powers originated from human-like beings. So the next step is trying to understand what is the true nature of this power, and we should start from what we know about how it works. And considering how both Caesar's smiles and Vegapunk's artificial devil fruit are applications of the knowledge about the lineage factor discovered by Vegapunk's outlaw research group, including also Caesar and Judgy, even without knowing what the devil power actually is, we can be fairly confident in assuming, at least in the case of Zone, it is somehow associated to the lineage factor of the respective animal. And analyzing the artificial process of objects possessing an ability, if we assume the possibility of transforming into an animal is connected to the presence of that animal lineage factor in the devil power, then considering Vegapunk's genius is not that surprising. He managed to extract that lineage factor from the fruit and combine it with weapons. However, from the examples we have in the manga, we can also deduce that for the process to be effective, the result must also contain the consciousness of the animal. And since it obviously cannot come from the object, its source can only be the devil power itself. This means that for what concerns Zone, the devil power contains not only the lineage factor of an animal, but also self-awareness. Interestingly, this aspect is also present in Caesar's artificial smiles, that in those cases where it's the head of the animal that the eater obtains, it maintains a self-consciousness separated from that of the smile user. And since another similarity those artificial products have with natural fruits, according to Shinobu, is that they make the eater weak if immersed in water, just like it happens for Vegapunk's artificial Ryuryu no Mi, considering that instead, as shown in Sanji's flashback during the Totland arc, the Paramecia-like modifications to the Windsmoke's lineage factors still allow them to come in contact with water and swim without problems. This means that rather than being associated to the modification of one's lineage factor, the water problem is actually related to the self-consciousness aspect of the devil power. This not only suggests that this component must be present also in Paramecia and Logia, respecting the idea that since all fruits have the same swirly pattern and awful taste, they all must have the same basic components and mechanism of action, but also that, differently from Judgy, Caesar managed to create something that, despite being a poor and evidently inferior imitation of Zone, gives a power with features much more similar to those of natural devil fruits. But if so, it seems kinda weird that he was, you could say, at least partially successful, while instead Vegapunk, who seems to be much better than him as a scientist, apparently couldn't, because his fruit was considered a failure. Now, without considering the fact his artificial Ryuryu no Mi actually works with the Momonosuke, because we will discuss this specific aspect later, this sort of contradiction actually contains very important elements for this theory, and it can be solved focusing on the evidently different moral code of the two scientists and on Caesar's relationship with Big Mom, which is something we can assume Vegapunk couldn't count on while creating his artificial zone. Indeed, if you think that even if the gigantification will certainly be incredibly important in next arcs, like for example Elbaf, it didn't really play any role both in Dressrosa and in Totland, despite it was being presented as the main connection between Caesar and Big Mom. A relationship between the two involving smiles will not only better complete the puzzle of that frail equilibrium between Yonko controlled by the Flamingo, but it will also be connected much more directly to the elements currently at the center of the plot, and even give much more sense to Lin Lin's presence in a Wano arc so profoundly connected to the effects of smiles, especially now that she has the opportunity of a direct interaction with Kai. Now, to understand how the Queen of Totland could be associated to smiles, and consequently what devil power actually is, a great help is given by her hat, Napoleon. Indeed, its capability to transform into different types of swords can only be explained with it possessing a Paramisha devil power. But then, even if the waving smoke judge modified his children's lineage factor to give them Paramisha-like abilities, could suggest that just like the animal system, also the superhuman system acts on the lineage factor itself. The fact that this would be impossible for Napoleon since he's just a hat with a soul inside confirms that to create an ability user is only necessary to combine this intangible substance that is the devil power with self-awareness, implying that possibly even fruits could use the ability they contain if they were aware of themselves. And while for weapons with zone, as we said before, this component is probably obtained by Vegapunk's way of treating the lineage factor contained in this category of devil powers, in Napoleon's case it clearly comes from the fragment of Big Mom's soul that resides in the hat. But if this allows us to definitely confirm the lineage factor is not the fundamental element of the devil power, but just a specific characteristic contained in the zone class, at the same time it apparently makes much more difficult to discover what this devil power actually is. To find an answer, we could start to consider the interpretation Jabra revealed in Eni's lobby, where in occasion of Spandam giving as a gift two unknown devil fruits to Kaku and Khalifa, he expressed the apparently superstitious belief that those who eat a devil fruit since then become possessed by an actual devil. But even if Oda presented and treated that statement again as a superstition, you should always remember that in One Piece each single word counts and each sentence must not be overlooked, especially in those cases where the apparently irrelevant concept is present more than once in different spots of the manga. Indeed, back in chapter 19, so at the very beginning of the series, Shanks during Buggy's flashback says that devil fruits are the incarnation of the seed devil, which sounding incredibly close to what Jabura said, but being expressed by a much more relevant character in a moment of the story where Oda wasn't that careful yet about giving away hints about the plot, suggests this idea may at least in part reflect the truth. And so we could start to think the devil power is actually the essence, or better the soul, of some sort of devil, and in this view the ability acquired by a person who eats a devil fruit could be the ability originally naturally possessed by that very devil whose soul is contained in that specific type of fruit. And this interpretation actually seems to put every piece of the puzzle in the right place, especially for what concerns Big Mom. Indeed, considering she ate the soul no Mi, this soul theory could explain not only how she could give to her hat, which clearly can't eat like a human being, the sword ability, but also how it's possible for Caesar's smiles to have features so similar to those of natural devil fruits, creating at the same time that Big Mom smiles connection we talked about before, which will give give much more sense to both her relationship with Caesar and to her involvement in the plot of the current Wano arc. Indeed, the similarities between Caesar's artificial products and devil fruits could come from the fact that, just like Natural Zone transferred the soul of some sort of demon with animal-related abilities into the Ether, Smiles could combine the results of Vegapunk's research with the souls of actual animals provided by Big Mom as part of the payment for the gigantification study to transfer those very animal souls into that 10% of people who successfully acquire an ability by eating a smile. And since we can assume that instead Vegapunk not only didn't have this type of connection with the Yonko, but also that probably his moral code wouldn't have allowed him to use animals in this way, this could explain why, differently from Caesar's approximately successful results, the artificial zone created by the greatest scientist of the world was a failure. Moreover, this interpretation can even give an explanation for this very faulty fruit working apparently just fine in Momonosuke's case. But to understand why, let's first consider that this soul idea is also strongly supported by what we saw during Nolan's flashback in the Skypiea arc. Indeed, there, Kalgara's daughter revealed that the population of Chandra believed the souls of their ancestors, who were those who fought to protect the Poneglyph and so were clearly enemies of the world government during the Void Century, were guided by the sound of the Golden Bell into sacred white trees of the forest called Trees of Embodiment. And if we decide to believe her, again following the principle, every detail in One Piece has a meaning connected to the rest of the story, and so nothing should be overlooked, considering that from trees to fruits the distance to cover is not that wide. If we combine this with what we concluded earlier in the video, that before starting to circle between humans and fruits, the devil power must have been possessed originally by humanoid beings, since for everything we saw in the manga nobody seems to know anything about devil fruits and how they work, and only recently Vegapunk's research is trying to partially uncover the mystery, we can conclude that the humanoid beings originally naturally possessing the abilities that are now transmitted together with their very souls through devil fruits were people belonging to the three winged races descended from the moon, and whose souls, as a consequence of what happened during the Void Century, because of some sort of mysterious process may be associated to the Soul and or Yomi Yomi powers, started to alternatively occupy living beings and fruits. And a hint about this being the truth could be contained in the way Oda drew the devil fruit cycle in Dressrosa. Indeed, one of the illustrations shows a soul leaving the body of an ability user when he dies, but even if it could easily seem that is the soul of the dead person, the fact that, differently from how the author represented Brooks one while explaining the Yomi Yomi no Mi, it has wings, makes not so unlikely that actually Oda there drew the soul of the winged person originally possessing the ability. By the way, this idea could also explain why Oda decided to give to devil fruits such an awful taste. Indeed, considering that a person who eats one of them is actually eating a soul, it would have been kinda weird that he found it tasty. Which suits with the Abysso Town folks finding instead the discarded smiles that, being faulty, probably didn't contain the animal souls we mentioned before, delicious. Returning to the theory itself, everything we said implies that at least part of the devil souls belonged to those who fought to protect Chandra's Poneglyph, and so were enemies of the founders of the world government during the Forbidden History. And this would explain a couple of more things. First of all, the very name Devil Fruits, which, not being known in Wano, that is probably an isolated country since the Void Century, considering what Otsuru said in chapter 914, we can be confident in thinking it was given after the end of that century, which suits with the idea that during the Forbidden History those souls were still inside the original possessors. But then, considering how the world government tends to name everything that opposes it using the words demons or devils, just like it happened with the archaeologists of O'Hara and probably even with the ancient giant race, which according to the Virrecarta book is said to have demon-like features. The possibility the self-proclaimed gods of the world gave the name devil to those fruits connected to the souls of their enemies makes a lot of sense, especially considering how Tenryubito treat devil fruits themselves. Indeed, not only we never saw one of them possessing an ability, but they also entertained themselves, giving them to slaves, just like it happened for Boa Hancock and her sisters. However, the enormous interest they demonstrated towards the Ope no Mi when it was possessed by DS barrels means that not only they know very well the true potential of the devil souls, but more importantly that they do not treat all of them in the same way, which suits with the fact that the fruits they give to slaves are apparently only Paramisha and Zon. And this different approach may suit with the idea, which I discussed in the first video of this series, that the Ancient War was actually a civil war, fought within the Ancient Kingdom founded by the winged folks who came from the moon, between two opposite factions associated respectively to those I called the scientific class and the ruling class of that population. Indeed, if the three winged races from the moon, the two I mentioned before plus the one I call the military class, founders of the Ancient Kingdom according to this theory, were truly those naturally possessing those supernatural abilities now involved in the devil fruit cycle, basing on the different features and in particular on the names of the three devil fruit categories, which by the way are all Greek terms, just like Uranus and Poseidon, and so related to an ancient flourishing civilization, just like it was according to Clover that of the Ancient Kingdom, we can easily associate each type of power to its own winged folk class, which would allow to connect the different ways the celestial dragons treat the abilities to the role individually played by the original possessors and more in general to each single class during the events of the Void Century. Indeed, the word Logia literally means communication of divine origins, and since just like the Tenryubito, the rulers of the winged folks, as we discovered in Skypiea, are all called gods, we can easily associate this category to the ruling class. For what concerns instead Zon, which literally means animal, the situation is a little bit trickier simply because it's more difficult to understand what the devil power originally consisted of. But considering that for what we said earlier about weapons with powers, these fruits must contain the lineage factor of an animal, my idea is that it was originally a power allowing a person who interacted in a specific way with the lineage factor of an animal of their choice to acquire the possibility to transform into the hybrid and animal forms we know very well. This would also explain the existence of abilities related to animals it's difficult to think lived on the moon, like for example dinosaurs or even dragons, which we know for a fact existed at some point in the One Piece world thanks to the tale about the sword god Ryuma slaying one of them. And remaining on this Wano dragons subject, this idea could also explain how Momonosuke could acquire the Dragon Zone ability from an artificial devil fruit considered to be a failure. Indeed, considering that Momo's mother Toki was said to come from a distant past, there's a chance she was born in a moment of history very close to the Void Century. And since for what we said in the first video of this theory, the people of Wano Kuni and in particular the Kutsuki clan are probably related to the winged folks who came from the moon, maybe her Toki Toki ability was not derived from a devil fruit, but instead it was her own natural superpower. And so it's possible Vegapunk's artificial fruit, which for what we said before couldn't work as a natural one because it was most likely created only through science, containing the lineage factor of a dragon similar to Kaido's, as we can deduce from the information revealed by the One Piece magazine, interacting with Momonosuke in, you could say, the correct way thanks to Vegapunk's studies on devil fruits, awakened the devil power contained in his blood because of her mother and was successful in giving him that zone ability, which is probably the only way an experiment considered a failure by the greatest scientist of the world himself could be a success in this very specific case. And so, since on the hieroglyphs on the moon, the military class, which most likely also had the duty to protect the god class, is depicted with the same long ears characterizing the members of Ener's god army, the goat-like features of the combatants we saw in Skypiea suggest that zone powers were associated to this class, which also suits with the idea this kind of ability, mainly focused on improving the user melee combat, perfectly fits a person meant to be a soldier. And this association would also suit the fact in Alabasta the Jackal and Falcon powers apparently are passed from generation to generation to protect the royal family, which being one of the founders of the world government can in turn be associated to the god class. So with the Logia being the powers of the ruling class and the Zone being the powers of the military class, the only possible combination left is Paramythia, which literally means fairy tale, with the scientific class. And the wide range of possibilities of this category of devil powers, in my opinion, kinda fits the creativity and eccentricity one expects from a scientist. Interestingly, assuming that the winged folks who descended from the moon were reduced to a very small amount of individuals because of the lack of resources, which is the very reason why they left their homeland as we discover in Ener's cover series, assuming also that as a consequence of the interaction with other races living on the blue planet, the descendants with mixed blood lost the superpowers, which would explain also why, even if, as we said before, the Devil Fruit cycle strongly suggests the abilities were originally possessed by humanoid beings, we never saw a single one of them in the story. This would explain not only the relatively limited number of different devil powers, which by the way could be all different from each other, simply because that of each winged person was determined by those factors making an individual unique and different from the others, but also, since in this view to maintain this trait of their race they needed to reproduce within the small group preserving the pure blood, the many similarities between different fruits, which could be due to direct blood connections between the original owners. Examples are the Magu Magu and the Mera Mera, the Hie Hie and the Yuki Yuki, the Moku Moku and the Gas Gas, the Doku Doku and Gas Gas, Gomu Gomu and Mochi Mochi, Sol Sol and Yomi Yomi, Kilo Kilo and Ton Ton, Bom Bom and Pam Pam, Fua Fua and Zushi Zushi, Supa Supa and Buki Buki, Kuri Kuri and Dela Dela, the group Awa Awa, Wash Wash, Sube Sube and Shibo Shibo. Not even talking about those devil powers that seem clearly a combination of other two, like for example the Gas Gas, which is apparently a combination of the Moku Moku and the Doku Doku. Another very interesting consequence of this way of interpreting the devil powers as an actual soul transferred by the devil fruit to the ether, which by the way would also suit with the name Oda chose to define ability users, Noryok Sha, that literally means Esper, is that it could explain the apparently natural affinity and aversion some ability characters seem to have towards each other, which could be influenced by the relationships the original possessors of those abilities had when they were still alive. An example is Boy Hancock's liking for Luffy, which happened kinda too fast and could be related to the Mero Mero and Gomu Gomu souls having a similar relationship during the Void Century. But a much more important example that starts to seem more like a proof of this idea is Luffy's aversion towards Teach. Indeed, not only during their first meeting they almost started a fight for no reason, and what's more, even if it wasn't the first time someone expressed an opinion different from Luffy's about food, it was the only occasion Mugiwara was even angered by that. But also, even if Sabo in Dressrosa clearly stated that he doesn't consider the Blackbeard pirates responsible for Ace's death, and he is sort of right, because it was Whitebeard's commander who searched for the fight, was defeated without tricks, and even handed over to the Marines alive, Luffy instead was immediately so incredibly furious with Teach, even in Impel Down and so when Ace was still alive, to the point he stopped his rush to save his brother just to start a fight with the man called Blackbeard. But if the adversion between Luffy and Teach is indeed, at least in part, influenced by the souls residing in them, then since the Yami Yami is a Logia and so for what we said before associated to the god class of the winged folks, while the Gomu Gomu is a Paramithia and so associated to the scientist class, this could become another element supporting the idea the Ancient War was actually a civil war fought within the Ancient Kingdom between factions controlled by these two classes. On the other hand, the similar adversion between Akainu and Aokiji that even brought them to fight each other despite they were both admirals, which sounds crazy especially considering that Kuzan's lazy attitude was brought to this point just because he didn't want Sakatsuki to become a fleet admiral, could mean that in each of the two factions were present members belonging to different categories of superpowers, as expected in a civil war where the conflict is caused by a contrast of ideals, and so where fighters decide which side they are on basing on their own values. Now, arrived to this point, there are only two aspects left to consider: the weakness in water and the impossibility to acquire more than one ability. For what concerns the first, we know that when immersed, the Devil Fruit users don't lose their power, but instead all of their energies, which is the reason why they become too weak to move and so they drown. But since this only happens with external water, while that present inside the body, no matter the quantity, doesn't cause the same effect, we can come to the conclusion that when people acquire abilities, their bodies start to release energy towards stationary water, which in the case of inner water, even working in the same way, will still keep the energy inside the body. And since Brook's case doesn't seem to be different from any other, even if he is only made of bones, it's clear that this weakness is not caused by particular changes in the structure of the person's body. And being it independent from the type of the power itself, following the flow of this theory, we can assume it is actually a property of the Devil's Soul the ability is associated to. However, we have literally no elements to try to understand where this property comes from, and my personal idea is that since this weakness is related to all types of water and not specifically to the composition of the sea, just like the supernatural powers, it was a natural characteristic of those races descended from the moon, which makes sense considering they came from an environment where we can assume water was never present. For what concerns instead the question of the two devil powers in one body, it's even more difficult to find an answer since it is only mentioned in the plot twice. The first is in Eni's lobby, in the situation we mentioned before, where Jabura was scared of the devils contained in the fruits Spandam gave to Kaku and Khalifa, and where Bueno reveals the scientist of the Grand Line had proved that if an ability user eat a second fruit, their body explodes without trace. And from the perspective of this theory, we can easily explain that simply assuming the way human beings are structured doesn't allow them to contain more than one devil soul, and so when a second fruit is eaten and the second soul is transferred, the capacity of the container is exceeded and so it explodes. However, it's impossible to understand how and why this happens, especially considering that the only other time this phenomenon is mentioned is in Marineford, where Teach manages to acquire the second ability because of the particular mysterious structure of his body. And even if we knew what is that makes him different, this still probably wouldn't explain why a normal person would have died instead. But it's also true that this thought may be influenced by my theory about how and why Blackbeard could obtain the Gura Gura no Mi, which I plan to focus on in one of the next uploads. And until then, that's all for this video. Thank you very much for watching, don't forget to leave a like, and make sure to watch also these other videos about the Void Century. See you next time, Jane.